Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. If you are listening to Mr. Ball Files because you enjoy stories that are strange, dark, and mysterious, especially the kind that unfold slowly and stay with you long after they end, then tonight's story is one you may want to hear all the way through before you decide whether you would ever go camping again. This is not a story about monsters jumping out of the trees or loud screams in the night. This is a quiet story, a realistic one. And that is exactly what makes it unsettling. Because every decision made in this story makes sense right up until the moment it becomes clear that it does not. This story is called They Set Up Camp in the Wrong Place. The story begins with three friends who had known each other since college. Their names were Aaron Cole, Matthew Brooks, and Daniel Reyes. They were all in their early 30s, lived in different states, and only managed to see each other once or twice a year. When they did get together, they usually tried to do something outdoors. Hiking, fishing, camping. It was their way of reconnecting and escaping normal life. In the late summer of 2018, Aaron suggested a camping trip to a remote section of national forest in the Northern Rockies. It was not a popular area. There were no established campgrounds, no ranger stations nearby, and only a few unmaintained trails that rarely showed up on hiking apps. That was exactly why Aaron liked it. He worked a high-stress job in software development and wanted silence. Real silence. Matthew and Daniel agreed almost immediately. Both of them had experience camping off-trail, and neither was reckless. They planned the trip carefully. They shared maps, downloaded offline GPS data, checked weather patterns, and filed a general itinerary with family members. The plan was simple. Hike in during the afternoon. Set up camp near a small creek marked on an old topographic map. Stay 2 nights. Then hike back out. The first day went smoothly. The trailhead was empty when they arrived. The hike in was harder than expected, mostly because the trail faded in and out, forcing them to rely on landmarks and elevation rather than visible paths. By late afternoon, they reached a low clearing surrounded by dense trees. A narrow creek ran through the area just as the map had promised. The clearing felt off, but none of them could explain why. It was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. No insects, no birds. Even the creek made almost no sound. Aaron joked that it felt like the volume of the forest had been turned down. Matthew laughed and said that was exactly what they had come for. They decided to set up camp there. They pitched their tents near the tree line and built a small fire pit using stones from the creek bed. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped quickly. The forest darkened in a way that felt heavier than normal, like the light was being absorbed rather than fading. That night, while they sat around the fire, Daniel mentioned something strange. He said the ground felt wrong under his boots. Not soft or unstable, just uneven in a way that made it hard to tell which direction sloped downward. Aaron shrugged it off, saying the terrain was probably shaped by old erosion patterns. Sometime after midnight, Matthew woke up suddenly. He could not explain why. There was no sound that he could remember hearing. He just felt awake, alert. He lay still in his tent, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, but there was still enough light to see faint shadows moving across the fabric of his tent as the flames flickered. Then he heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, heavy enough to sound human. Matthew assumed it was Aaron getting up to use the bathroom. He called out quietly, but there was no response. The footsteps stopped immediately. Matthew waited, holding his breath. After several seconds, the footsteps started again, this time circling the campsite. They moved past his tent, then past Daniel's, then faded into the trees. The next morning, Matthew told the others what he had heard. Aaron said he had not left his tent. Daniel said the same. They checked the ground around the camp and found no footprints. The soil was soft enough that someone walking through should have left clear impressions. There were none. They laughed it off, but the mood shifted. Later that day, they decided to explore the area around the camp. According to the map, there should have been a ridge less than a mile to the east that offered a clear view of the valley. They walked for nearly an hour and never reached it. The terrain seemed to subtly curve, guiding them back toward the clearing without them realizing it. When Aaron checked the GPS, it showed them moving in a rough circle, even though none of them remembered turning. By late afternoon, they were tired and uneasy. Daniel suggested moving camp to a different location, but Aaron argued that packing up and hiking in fading light was more dangerous than staying put. They agreed to stay one more night and leave early in the morning. That second night, the forest was not quiet. They heard distant sounds that did not echo properly. Branches snapping far away, but never getting closer. The creek seemed louder now, almost rushing, even though there had been no rain. At one point, Matthew noticed that the firelight was not casting shadows in the direction it should have been based on where they were sitting. Around 2 in the morning, Daniel woke the others. He said he could hear whispering. They listened in silence. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, just beyond the tree line, there was a sound that almost resembled voices. More like breath shaped into patterns. The sound moved slowly around the clearing, never entering the firelight. Aaron stood up and shouted into the darkness, telling whoever was out there to leave. The sound stopped instantly. None of them slept after that. When morning came, the clearing looked different. The creek was no longer where it had been. The shallow channel they had collected water from was gone, replaced by dry stones. The forest edge seemed closer, as if the clearing had shrunk overnight. Aaron checked his GPS again. It showed their location several hundred yards away from where it had placed them the day before, even though they had not moved camp. That was when they realized something else. Their tents were not aligned the same way they had set them up. The stakes were still in the ground, but the tents themselves had rotated slightly during the night. Not enough to be obvious at first glance, but enough that the doors now faced inward toward the fire pit instead of outward toward the trees. They packed up immediately. As they hiked away from the clearing, the forest seemed to resist them. Fallen logs blocked their path in places where none had been before. The light dimmed even though it was still morning. At one point, Matthew looked back and could no longer see the clearing at all, even though they had only walked for a few minutes. Then, Daniel tripped and fell. When Aaron helped him up, Daniel said the ground had shifted under his foot, like stepping onto something that moved. He refused to keep walking and insisted they stop and rest. Aaron reluctantly agreed. They never found that resting spot again. Hours later, search and rescue teams found Aaron and Matthew wandering along a service road miles away from where they had entered the forest. They were dehydrated, confused, and missing large portions of time. Daniel was not with them. Aaron and Matthew told the same story separately. They said Daniel had stood up suddenly, looked back in the direction of the camp, and said, very calmly, that he needed to return something. Then he walked into the trees and did not come back. Search teams scoured the area for weeks. They found the clearing once, according to one ranger, but could not relocate it after marking the coordinates. No trace of Daniel was ever found. No equipment, no remains. Nothing. Years later, Aaron admitted something he had never told anyone before. On the last night, when the whispering stopped, he said he felt something shift beneath his feet, not the ground, the place itself, as if the clearing was not just a location but something temporary, something that allowed them to be there only briefly. They did not set up camp near danger. They set it up inside something, and whatever it was, it noticed. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. If you enjoy stories that are strange, dark, and mysterious, then tonight's story is going to stay with you. Not because of jump scares, not because of monsters hiding in the shadows, but because everything you are about to hear actually happened, and even today, no one can fully explain how it was possible. This story is known as 6 Million Steps, and this is the real story. Most people believe they understand distance. We measure it in miles, in kilometers, in time spent walking or driving. We trust maps. We trust trail markers. We trust that if we walk long enough in one direction, we will eventually reach something familiar. But there are rare places on Earth where distance stops behaving the way it should, where a short hike can stretch into something endless, and where each step quietly carries you farther away from reality than you ever intended. The man at the center of this story was named Daniel Mercer. Daniel was not reckless. he was not inexperienced, and he was not chasing danger. In fact, Daniel was the kind of person who planned everything carefully. He worked as a survey technician, mapping terrain for infrastructure projects. He understood elevation, slope, and distance better than most people ever would. Hiking was not a thrill for him. It was a way to feel grounded. In the fall of 2017, Daniel took a solo hiking trip to a remote mountain range in the Pacific Northwest. The area was legal to access, but rarely visited. Locals referred to the region casually as Deadland, not because of any official danger, but because almost nothing lived there. The soil was poor, the weather shifted unpredictably, and compasses were known to behave strangely, though no one had ever proven why. Daniel planned a 3-day hike. He filed his route with a local ranger station, packed enough food for 5 days, and brought a satellite locator beacon. According to his plan, the total distance he intended to walk was just under 30 miles. It was challenging, but well within his limits. On the first day, everything went exactly as expected. Daniel followed the trail markers, documented landmarks with his camera, and made camp just before sunset. That night, he recorded a short audio journal on his phone. His voice was calm. He sounded relaxed. He said the forest felt unusually quiet, but not in a threatening way, just still. On the second morning, Daniel broke camp and continued along the trail. That was the last time anyone saw him following a marked path. At some point late that morning, Daniel noticed something strange. His GPS showed that he had walked less than 3 miles since sunrise. But according to his internal sense of time and effort, he should have covered at least double that distance. He assumed the terrain was slowing him down. Steep inclines can distort perception. Dense fog can do the same. By early afternoon, the fog had thickened to the point where Daniel could barely see 20 feet ahead. He checked his compass and frowned. The needle was rotating slowly, never settling. He tried again. Same result. Daniel did what he was trained to do. He stopped. He marked his position. And he decided to retrace his steps back to the last known landmark. But after walking for nearly an hour, nothing changed. The trees looked the same, the ground felt the same beneath his boots, no trail markers appeared, no break in the fog. According to his GPS, he was moving. According to his body, he was exhausting himself. According to the world around him, he was going nowhere. That night, Daniel did something he never did before. He walked after dark. In a second audio recording, his breathing was heavier. He laughed once, nervously, and said he must be more tired than he thought. He mentioned that his step counter showed an impossible number. He said the device claimed he had taken over 50,000 steps that day alone. He joked that it must be broken. On the third day, Daniel activated his satellite beacon. The signal was weak, but clear enough to be received. Rescue teams were dispatched immediately. Based on the coordinates, Daniel was less than 5 miles from his planned route. On paper, reaching him should have taken less than half a day. But when the first search team arrived at the location transmitted by the beacon, Daniel was not there. They expanded the search radius. They followed the signal as it drifted, sometimes jumping hundreds of yards between readings. It was as if the beacon itself was moving without a clear direction. 3 days later, a second signal came through. This time, Daniel's beacon transmitted continuously for almost an hour before going silent again. Using triangulation, search teams narrowed his position to a narrow valley surrounded by steep rock faces. That was where they found him. Daniel was alive. Barely. He was sitting upright against a rock, boots worn nearly smooth, clothing torn and soaked, hands raw and bleeding. He did not look injured in a conventional way. There were no broken bones, no signs of attack. But his body showed the kind of exhaustion typically seen in ultra-endurance athletes after days of nonstop movement. When Daniel was evacuated and stabilized, doctors estimated that he had burned through enough calories to suggest he had walked an impossible distance. When asked how far he believed he had traveled, Daniel whispered a single sentence: "I never stopped walking." In the weeks that followed, Daniel slowly recovered physically, but mentally, something had changed. He struggled to explain what happened in that fog. Every attempt ended the same way. He would stop mid-sentence, stare at the floor, and shake his head. Eventually, he agreed to give a full recorded statement. Daniel said that after the fog closed in, the forest began to repeat itself. Not in an obvious way, but in subtle patterns. The same fallen tree, the same bent branch, the same rock formation, over and over again. At first, he believed he was walking in circles, but then he realized something worse. His GPS data showed that he was moving in a straight line. Daniel said that time stopped behaving normally. He would walk for what felt like minutes, then check his watch and discover hours had passed. Other times, he would walk for what felt like an entire day, only to see that barely any time had moved at all. The most disturbing part came on what he believed was the fifth day. Daniel said he began hearing footsteps behind him. At first, they matched his own pace. When he slowed down, they slowed down. When he stopped, they stopped. He never saw anyone. The fog was too thick, but he could feel something following him, just out of sight. He said that every time he tried to turn around, the ground beneath him seemed to tilt, forcing him forward. Daniel eventually stopped sleeping altogether. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt like he was falling backward, as if the world behind him no longer existed. At some point, he checked his step counter again. The number displayed was over 6 million. Daniel said that was the moment he understood something was very wrong, because no human body could survive that kind of distance, and yet he was still standing. When rescue teams later analyzed Daniel's equipment, they confirmed that his step counter was functioning correctly. Based on stride length and wear patterns on his boots, experts estimated that Daniel had indeed walked a distance equivalent to several hundred miles. But here is where the story becomes truly unsettling. The total time Daniel was missing was just under 8 days. Even under extreme endurance conditions, even if Daniel had walked non-stop, even if he never slept, the distance implied by 6 million steps should have taken weeks, not days. There was only one explanation that fit the data. Daniel had been walking somewhere else. Today, Daniel refuses to hike. He moved away from the Pacific Northwest and avoids forests entirely. He says that sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, he still feels the urge to keep walking, as if stopping is dangerous. He once told an interviewer that he does not believe he was lost. He believes he crossed into something adjacent to our world, a place where distance stretches and time folds, a place where the only way out is to keep moving. And he believes that if he had ever stopped walking completely, he would never have come back. That is the real story of 6 million steps. And if you ever find yourself walking through fog, feeling like the world around you is repeating, do not trust your sense of distance. Because some paths do not lead somewhere. They only take you farther away. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. Now, let's set the scene. The year is 2007. We are in a quiet, unassuming suburb of Portland, Oregon. The house in question, a 2-story colonial with a detached garage, looked perfectly normal from the outside. It was the kind of house you wouldn't look at twice. And that's exactly what made what happened inside so terrifying. The couple who bought it were Mark and Julia Hayes. Mark was a history professor, a pragmatic man who believed in facts and documented evidence. Julia was an artist, creative and open to possibilities, but still grounded. They were in their late 40s and looking for a fresh start. They bought the house, located at 3734 Willow Creek Road, in the month of May, and moved in shortly after. The problems started subtly, almost immediately, and were quickly dismissed as moving stress or forgetfulness. The first incident involved Mark's desk. Mark had a meticulous system for organizing his historical documents. On a Tuesday afternoon, Mark clearly remembered leaving a stack of rare Civil War-era letters, worth close to $10,000, neatly piled on the left corner of his large oak desk. He left the study to grab coffee. When he returned only 5 minutes later, the letters were gone. He tore the room apart. Julia helped him. They searched for over 2 hours. Nothing. Mark, annoyed, blamed himself. He figured he must have moved them to a shelf while on the phone, forgetting the entire transaction. 3 days later, the letters reappeared. They weren't tucked away or hidden. They were back on the left corner of the desk, in the exact pile he had left them in originally. Mark was stunned. He hadn't touched the desk since the search. Julia hadn't been in the room. This wasn't just misplacement. This was a momentary, physical relocation of objects. The incidents escalated and began to involve their memory. Julia started forgetting conversations. Mark would mention something, say a dinner reservation they had made for the following Saturday, and Julia would look at him blankly. "Reservation for what, Mark?" "We agreed we were ordering pizza," she would insist. She would be so firm, so absolutely certain of her memory that Mark would start to doubt his own. Was he the one having the lapse? He was getting older, after all. The reverse also happened. Julia would bring up a detailed memory. "Remember when we decided to paint the kitchen that pale blue?" Mark would have no recollection whatsoever of the decision, the discussion, or the color choice. They would argue, becoming increasingly frustrated and scared by the gap between their realities. One evening, Mark was downstairs watching television. He paused the show and went upstairs to the master bedroom to retrieve his glasses. He walked into the room, grabbed his glasses from the nightstand, and walked back downstairs. He unpaused the television. He watched maybe 30 seconds of the show before he looked down. He wasn't wearing his glasses. He checked his pockets. Not there. He realized he had walked upstairs, gone into the room, seen the glasses, and somehow returned downstairs without them. It was a blank spot, a momentary loss of logic and purpose that only lasted the time it took him to walk down the stairs. But here is where it gets truly unsettling. He didn't realize his mistake until he got back downstairs. It was as if a piece of his consciousness had been momentarily muted. Julia was also experiencing this sense of being muted. One afternoon, she was upstairs painting in her studio. She needed a specific shade of crimson paint. She went downstairs, walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and stood there for a full minute, staring at the milk and eggs. She eventually closed the refrigerator door, walked back upstairs to the studio, and sat down, completely forgetting why she had gone downstairs in the first place. She didn't realize she still needed the crimson paint until 20 minutes later. They started keeping logs. Not just a journal, but a detailed log of every object misplaced, every memory lapse, and every time they had to recheck a room because it felt wrong. They quickly noticed a disturbing pattern. The lapses in memory, the misplaced objects, they almost always occurred when they were moving between rooms, specifically when they were on the stairs or passing through the main hallway. The house itself seemed to be the trigger. The most terrifying moment happened in the month of October, 5 months after they moved in. Julia was in the living room. She glanced down the long main hallway toward the kitchen. She saw Mark standing at the kitchen counter reading a newspaper. She called out to him, "Mark, can you take the dog out in a minute?" Mark didn't move. He just kept reading the paper. Julia called again, louder this time, "Mark." Still no movement. She sighed and started walking down the hallway towards him. As she took maybe 3 steps, she realized something was deeply wrong with the scene. The Mark she was looking at was wearing a blue sweater. Mark had been wearing a gray one all day, and the newspaper he was holding looked like it was folded differently. She stopped moving. She stood motionless in the hallway. Suddenly, she felt a strong hand grab her shoulder. She screamed and spun around. It was Mark. He was standing right behind her, wearing the gray sweater. "What's wrong? Why are you screaming?" he asked, genuinely alarmed. Julia pointed frantically down the hallway. You were just standing there, in the kitchen, reading a paper." Mark walked to the end of the hall. The kitchen was empty. There was no newspaper. Julia was trembling. She hadn't seen a ghost. She had seen a duplicate of her husband a few feet away in a different outfit. But the truly chilling detail was that the real Mark had been directly behind her the entire time, meaning the Mark she saw in the kitchen was standing there while the real Mark was approaching her from the living room. They called a therapist. They feared they were both experiencing shared psychosis. The therapist, a skeptical, no-nonsense woman, listened to their detailed logs and recommended they leave the house immediately. She couldn't explain the missing objects, but she recognized the severe psychological distress. They decided to move out by the end of the year. As they were packing, Mark was wrapping a large mirror in the main hallway. He was securing the bubble wrap with heavy packing tape when he paused. He looked at the reflection of the hallway in the wrapped mirror. Everything looked normal, but then he noticed something that was not normal. There was a section of the hallway wall near the coat closet that was painted a dark, unsettling shade of maroon. In real life, that section of wall was painted the same pale cream as the rest of the house. Mark immediately stopped packing and went to that spot on the wall. He touched it, smooth, painted cream. He backed up, looked at the mirror. The mirror still showed the maroon wall. He grabbed his flashlight and shone it at the spot. Nothing changed. The reality was cream. The reflection was maroon. Then he noticed a tiny, almost invisible seam in the wallpaper where the mirror showed the maroon section. He peeled back the cream wallpaper. Underneath, he found 2 layers of old paint. The bottom layer was a dark, dried blood maroon. He called Julia over. They spent the next hour pulling down all the wallpaper in that section. The maroon paint was there, sure, but what was behind the paint was the ultimate terror. Underneath the maroon paint, someone, the previous owner, perhaps had written thousands of tiny, repeating phrases. The phrases were written in a jagged, panicked hand, repeating the same lines over and over. Where is the key? It is not Tuesday. I didn't say that. I can't remember. It was a written chronicle of the same exact psychological chaos they had been experiencing. Someone else had lived in that house and been systematically stripped of their sanity and memory, just like Mark and Julia. The house wasn't haunted by a ghost. It was haunted by a psychic residue of madness, the building itself feeding on the confusion of its residents. Mark and Julia left the house that day, leaving all their furniture behind. They sold it months later, disclosing everything they knew to the buyers, a large investment firm. They never got any confirmation, but they heard rumors that the house was immediately torn down and the lot paved over. To this day, they still occasionally catch themselves confusing a memory, or looking for an object they know they put down but cannot find. They call these moments the house tingle, a horrifying little reminder that the house may have been destroyed, but the infection it planted in their minds is permanent. And that, my friends, is one of the most terrifying examples of a physical location driving a person, or in this case, a couple, completely and utterly insane. It's a truly strange, dark, and mysterious story. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, stay safe out there. This story is about a group of adrenaline junkies who went searching for the ultimate thrill in a place they absolutely should not have entered. They thought they were testing their limits against the cold and the dark, but what they were actually testing was the very boundary between our world and the next. They were looking for something terrifying, and what they found wasn't just terrifying, it was personal. This is the story of the last thing they saw was their own face. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. Now, we travel to the Pacific Northwest, specifically a remote, abandoned copper mine deep in the Cascade Mountains. The year is 2020. The mine, known locally as the Black Lung, had been closed since the 1950s after a tragic collapse killed 3 miners. It was dangerous, unstable, and officially sealed off with concrete and steel beams. Our group consists of 4 friends: Leo, the leader and cameraman, Maya, the medic, Sam, the structural engineer, and Chloe, the documentarian. Their goal was to penetrate the deepest section of the Black Lung, the rumored 900-foot level, which supposedly held a massive untouched deposit of copper ore. They used heavy-duty cutting equipment to bypass the concrete seal. At 10 o'clock at night on a dark October night, they slipped inside the mine entrance. The air inside was freezing and immediately damp. It was pitch black, save for their headlamps. The initial descent was tough. The timbers were rotten and the shaft was slippery. After maybe 2 hours of careful climbing and descending, they reached the first major tunnel. They set up their base camp maybe 50 feet down this tunnel. Sam, the engineer, checked the air quality and confirmed it was safe enough, though the temperature was hovering just above freezing. They pressed forward into the labyrinthine tunnels. They were using high-powered flashlights, but the light seemed to be swallowed by the blackness of the damp stone. It was strangely quiet. The natural echoes you expect in a mine were muted. as if the walls were absorbing sound. Their primary challenge was the descent to the 900-foot level. The main shaft was collapsed. Sam found a side passage that was barely big enough for a person to squeeze through. It led downward, steeply. Leo, ever the thrill-seeker, went first. They were all wearing communication headsets. Leo was maybe 20 feet down when he spoke into his mic, his voice tight with adrenaline. "It's weird down here. It feels compressed. I can barely breathe." Maya, checking his oxygen levels remotely, confirmed his vitals were fine. "It's just the tight space, Leo. Keep going." Leo continued his descent. When he reached the bottom of the cramped shaft, he emerged into a massive cavern. He gasped into the mic. "Guys, you won't believe this," he said. "It's enormous. It's easily 50 feet tall, and I can't even see the far wall. And there's something here." He directed his powerful light beam around the cavern. The beam eventually landed on the center of the floor. There, carved directly into the bedrock, was a perfectly smooth, circular stone slab. The slab was maybe 4 feet in diameter, and it was polished to an impossibly high sheen, reflecting the light perfectly. It looked exactly like a massive, primitive mirror. Sam squeezed through the tight passage next, followed by Maya and Chloe. All four stood in the cavern, silent, staring at the reflecting stone slab. "What is that?" whispered Chloe. "It's unnatural. Look how smooth it is." Sam walked carefully toward the slab, shining his light on it. "It's not glass. It's obsidian, maybe? It's reflecting everything, but it feels cold, colder than the rest of the mine." As Sam's light hit the slab, the reflection was stunningly clear. The 4 figures of the urban explorers were perfectly visible in the center of the mine floor. Leo, filming the entire thing, noted something strange. "Wait a second. Look at our reflections, guys. Look closely." They all stared into the polished slab. Their reflections were clear, but there was a distortion. The 4 reflected figures were standing closer together than the actual people were. They were huddled, almost pressed shoulder to shoulder, even though in reality, they were standing maybe 6 feet apart. "Maybe it's the curvature of the stone?" Maya suggested, uneasy. "It's not curvature," Sam whispered. "Look at the background." In the reflection, the enormous cavern was gone. Instead of the massive, dark space they were in, the background of the reflection was pure, featureless white. They were looking at 4 figures huddled together in a brilliant white void. Then, the reflection did something that made their blood run cold. The reflected figures in the stone slab began to move, independently of the people standing over them. The reflections of Leo, Maya, Sam, and Chloe slowly turned their heads. They turned to look at the center of the mirror, not at the ceiling, but directly at the actual people standing above the slab. The reflected faces were still their own faces, but they were frozen in expressions of utter primal terror. Leo screamed, "Move! Get away from it!" They stumbled backward, tripping over their own gear. The polished stone slab seemed to glow faintly in the dark. As they scrambled back, 2 things happened almost simultaneously. First, they realized the terrifying silence was gone. The mine was no longer quiet. It was filled with a chorus of faint, choked whispers. It sounded like dozens of voices, all talking at once, frantic and muffled, emanating from the walls themselves. Second, Sam, the engineer, glanced down at the reflection one last time as he backed away. The 4 terrified reflected faces were no longer looking up at them. The reflections had completely vanished. Instead, the center of the obsidian slab was now reflecting a single, enormous, dark face. It was a face composed entirely of shadows, featureless except for 2 deeply sunken holes that looked like empty eyes. The face took up the entire diameter of the stone. The mine air grew instantly, impossibly cold. The whispering voices intensified into a panicked shriek. "Go, go, go," Leo yelled. They turned and raced for the cramped upward passage, scrambling in a blind panic. Sam was the last to climb into the tight shaft. He was pulling his heavy backpack when he heard a sound, not the whispering, but a single, distinct, wet thump behind him. He shined his light back into the cavern, desperate to see what the dark face belonged to. He didn't see the dark face. He saw Chloe. Chloe was lying face down on the cold stone floor, maybe 20 feet away from the polished slab. She wasn't moving. "Chloe," Sam screamed into his mic. "I've got eyes on Chloe. She's down." He started to crawl out to retrieve her, but Leo screamed back. "Sam! No! Get up here now! The air is collapsing." Sam hesitated. He looked at Chloe, inert on the ground, and then he looked at the polished stone slab. 1 times 17, 17 and 1 times and 45 and 18 7, 1 17 of a stott brooding. The stone was no longer reflecting the cavern, or the white void, or the dark face. It was reflecting Chloe's body. And slowly, agonizingly, the reflection of Chloe's body began to fade, starting with her feet and crawling upward like cold ink spreading on paper. In the final second, before Sam turned and scrambled into the passage, he saw the mirror had faded entirely. All that was left in the reflection, right where Chloe's face had been, was a single, tiny, frozen image of her own screaming face. Sam slammed himself into the narrow shaft and scrambled upward. He, Leo, and Maya got out of the black lung 30 minutes later, frantic and covered in grime. They called the police. Search and rescue launched an immediate mission, but the team was only able to get 70 feet inside before the tunnel system collapsed completely. There was no sign of Chloe. She was gone. The authorities dismissed the incident as a tragic caving accident exacerbated by panic. But the 3 survivors know the truth. They know that whatever was in that cavern, that ancient reflective stone, was not just reflecting light. It was reflecting the boundary between life and whatever came next. And when it was done with its victims, it absorbed them completely, leaving behind only the personalized horror of that final, panicked, reflected image. And that, my friends, is why this story of a mind with a mirror is one of the most strange, dark, and mysterious I have ever heard. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, stay safe out there. This story is about the thin, terrifying line between what we imagine in our sleep and what actually exists in the physical world. We have all had those nightmares where we wake up gasping, heart racing, only to realize with a wave of relief that it was just a dream. But for one woman in a quiet suburb, that relief never came. Instead, she opened her eyes to find that the horror she thought she had escaped was standing right at the foot of her bed, waiting for her to join the waking world. This is the story of the nightmare that became reality when she woke up. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It is always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. Now, we head to a peaceful neighborhood in Savannah, Georgia. The year is 2022. Our main character is 31-year-old Maya Vance. Maya was a successful interior designer who had just moved into a beautiful, historic townhouse that she had spent 6 months renovating. She was independent, logical, and not the type of person who easily got spooked. The house was her masterpiece, filled with high-end furniture and a state-of-the-art security system. On the night of October 14th, 2022, Maya went to bed around 11 o'clock at night. It had been a long day of moving heavy boxes, and she fell into a deep, heavy sleep almost immediately. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the dream began. In the dream, Maya was standing in the middle of her new living room. Everything looked exactly as it did in real life, except for one thing: the lighting. The room was bathed in a sickly, pulsating yellow glow. She felt a heavy, crushing sense of dread. In the dream, she heard a sound coming from the kitchen, a slow, rhythmic scraping noise, like a metal blade being dragged across stone. Maya walked toward the kitchen, her heart pounding against her ribs. When she reached the doorway, she saw a figure. It was a tall, unnaturally thin man with skin the color of wet parchment. He was hunched over her kitchen island, and he was holding a long, rusted carving knife. He was slowly, methodically carving deep, jagged lines into the marble countertop. The man stopped and slowly turned his head. He had no eyes, just deep, hollow pits filled with a thick, black fluid. He opened his mouth to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth and whispered one word: "Found." Maya screamed in the dream and bolted toward the stairs. She could hear the wet, slapping sound of his bare feet hitting the hardwood floor right behind her. She reached her bedroom, slammed the door, and locked it. She threw herself onto her bed and pulled the covers over her head, praying to wake up. And then she did. Maya snapped awake. Her heart was racing, and she was drenched in a cold sweat. She took a deep breath, clutching her chest. She looked around her bedroom. The moonlight was filtering through the curtains, casting soft blue shadows. It was quiet. The yellow glow was gone. The scraping sound was gone. She was safe. She checked her phone on the nightstand. It was 2:22 in the morning. She told herself it was just the stress of the move. She got out of bed to get a glass of water, laughing at how vivid the nightmare had been. She walked to her bedroom door and reached for the handle. She stopped. The door was already unlocked. Maya clearly remembered locking it before she went to sleep. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. She slowly opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The house was silent. She walked down the stairs, her bare feet making almost no noise on the wood. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she looked toward the kitchen. The lights were off. She walked into the kitchen and turned on the overhead light. She looked at the marble island. Her breath hitched in her throat. There, in the center of the pristine white marble, were three deep, jagged lines carved into the stone. They were fresh. There was white marble dust still sitting on the edges of the cuts. Maya felt like the floor was falling out from under her. This was exactly what the man had been doing in her dream. She looked toward the back door. It was locked from the inside. She checked her security app on her phone. No sensors had been triggered. No cameras had captured any movement. She was alone in the house. She told herself she must have done it in her sleep. Maybe she was sleepwalking due to the stress. She went back upstairs, locked her bedroom door again, and sat on the edge of the bed, too terrified to close her eyes. About 20 minutes passed. The silence of the house was absolute. And then, Maya heard it, coming from right outside her bedroom door. The slow, rhythmic scraping noise. It was moving closer. Maya grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but as the line started to ring, her phone screen suddenly flickered and turned bright, pulsating yellow. The call disconnected. The scraping noise stopped right outside her door. Maya stared at the bottom of the door, where a sliver of light from the hallway usually showed. That sliver of light was now blocked by two dark, thin shadows. Someone was standing right there, and then the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, methodically. Maya watched in horror as the lock she had just engaged clicked open by itself. The door creaked open just a few inches. A thick, black fluid began to ooze from the hinges, dripping onto the floor with a wet, slapping sound. Maya scrambled to the corner of her bed, screaming for help. The door swung wide. Standing in the doorway was the man from her dream, the parchment skin, the hollow pits for eyes, the rusted knife. He stepped into the room, and as he did, the blue moonlight vanished, replaced by that sickly yellow glow. He leaned forward, the black fluid leaking from his eye sockets, and he whispered the same word, "Found." Maya threw her lamp at him, but it passed through his body as if he were made of smoke. He lunged at her, the rusted knife raised high. Maya squeezed her eyes shut and felt a sharp, searing pain in her shoulder. She screamed one last time, and then, total darkness. Maya woke up again. She was back in her bed. The sun was shining through the windows. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. She was gasping for air. She immediately reached for her shoulder. There was no pain. There was no blood. Her nightshirt was dry. She looked at her bedroom door. It was locked. She felt a massive wave of relief. It had been a false awakening, a dream within a dream. She got out of bed, feeling a bit shaky but immensely grateful. She went downstairs to the kitchen, determined to put the whole ordeal behind her. She walked to the marble island to start the coffee. She stopped. The 3 jagged lines were there. They were carved deep into the marble. Maya backed away, her hands shaking. She looked at her phone. The screen was normal, but when she checked her call logs, there was a call to 911 at 2:22 that lasted 0 seconds. She ran to the front door, wanting to get out of the house. As she reached for the deadbolt, she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. She stopped. She slowly pulled the collar of her nightshirt down, exposing her right shoulder. There, etched into her skin in dark, bruised lines, was the word "found." The nightmare hadn't ended when she woke up. The nightmare had simply waited for her to be fully conscious so she could experience the terror of knowing it was real. Maya Vance moved out of that house that same day. She never went back, not even for her furniture. She tells people she moved because of the commute, but the truth is, she is terrified of falling asleep in any room with a marble counter because she knows that somewhere that man is still carving, and he knows exactly where she is. And that, my friends, is why this story of a dream that crossed the border into reality is truly strange, dark, and mysterious. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, stay safe out there. This story is about the thin, terrifying line between what we imagine in our sleep and what actually exists in the physical world. We have all had those nightmares where we wake up gasping, heart racing, only to realize with a wave of relief that it was just a dream. But for one woman in a quiet suburb, that relief never came. Instead, she opened her eyes to find that the horror she thought she had escaped was standing right at the foot of her bed, waiting for her to join the waking world. This is the story of the nightmare that became reality when she woke up. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It is always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. Now, we head to a peaceful neighborhood in Savannah, Georgia. The year is 2022. Our main character is 31-year-old Maya Vance. Maya was a successful interior designer who had just moved into a beautiful, historic townhouse that she had spent 6 months renovating. She was independent, logical, and not the type of person who easily got spooked. The house was her masterpiece, filled with high-end furniture and a state-of-the-art security system. On the night of October 14th, 2022, Maya went to bed around 11 o'clock at night. It had been a long day of moving heavy boxes, and she fell into a deep, heavy sleep almost immediately. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the dream began. In the dream, Maya was standing in the middle of her new living room. Everything looked exactly as it did in real life, except for one thing: the lighting. The room was bathed in a sickly, pulsating yellow glow. She felt a heavy, crushing sense of dread. In the dream, she heard a sound coming from the kitchen, a slow, rhythmic scraping noise, like a metal blade being dragged across stone. Maya walked toward the kitchen, her heart pounding against her ribs. When she reached the doorway, she saw a figure. It was a tall, unnaturally thin man with skin the color of wet parchment. He was hunched over her kitchen island, and he was holding a long, rusted carving knife. He was slowly, methodically carving deep, jagged lines into the marble countertop. The man stopped and slowly turned his head. He had no eyes, just deep, hollow pits filled with a thick, black fluid. He opened his mouth to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth and whispered one word: "Found." Maya screamed in the dream and bolted toward the stairs. She could hear the wet, slapping sound of his bare feet hitting the hardwood floor right behind her. She reached her bedroom, slammed the door, and locked it. She threw herself onto her bed and pulled the covers over her head, praying to wake up. And then she did. Maya snapped awake. Her heart was racing, and she was drenched in a cold sweat. She took a deep breath, clutching her chest. She looked around her bedroom. The moonlight was filtering through the curtains, casting soft blue shadows. It was quiet. The yellow glow was gone. The scraping sound was gone. She was safe. She checked her phone on the nightstand. It was 2:22 in the morning. She told herself it was just the stress of the move. She got out of bed to get a glass of water, laughing at how vivid the nightmare had been. She walked to her bedroom door and reached for the handle. She stopped. The door was already unlocked. Maya clearly remembered locking it before she went to sleep. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. She slowly opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The house was silent. She walked down the stairs, her bare feet making almost no noise on the wood. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she looked toward the kitchen. The lights were off. She walked into the kitchen and turned on the overhead light. She looked at the marble island. Her breath hitched in her throat. There, in the center of the pristine white marble, were three deep, jagged lines carved into the stone. They were fresh. There was white marble dust still sitting on the edges of the cuts. Maya felt like the floor was falling out from under her. This was exactly what the man had been doing in her dream. She looked toward the back door. It was locked from the inside. She checked her security app on her phone. No sensors had been triggered. No cameras had captured any movement. She was alone in the house. She told herself she must have done it in her sleep. Maybe she was sleepwalking due to the stress. She went back upstairs, locked her bedroom door again, and sat on the edge of the bed, too terrified to close her eyes. About 20 minutes passed. The silence of the house was absolute. And then Maya heard it, coming from right outside her bedroom door. The slow, rhythmic scraping noise. It was moving closer. Maya grabbed her phone and dialed 911. But as the line started to ring, her phone screen suddenly flickered and turned bright, pulsating yellow. The call disconnected. The scraping noise stopped right outside her door. Maya stared at the bottom of the door, where a sliver of light from the hallway usually showed. That sliver of light was now blocked by two dark, thin shadows. Someone was standing right there. And then the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, methodically. Maya watched in horror as the lock she had just engaged clicked open by itself. The door creaked open just a few inches. A thick, black fluid began to ooze from the hinges, dripping onto the floor with a wet, slapping sound. Maya scrambled to the corner of her bed, screaming for help. The door swung wide. Standing in the doorway was the man from her dream. The parchment skin, the hollow pits for eyes, the rusted knife. He stepped into the room, and as he did, the blue moonlight vanished, replaced by that sickly yellow glow. He leaned forward, the black fluid leaking from his eye sockets, and he whispered the same word, "Found." Maya threw her lamp at him, but it passed through his body as if he were made of smoke. He lunged at her, the rusted knife raised high. Maya squeezed her eyes shut and felt a sharp, searing pain in her shoulder. She screamed one last time, and then total darkness. Maya woke up again. She was back in her bed. The sun was shining through the windows. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. She was gasping for air. She immediately reached for her shoulder. There was no pain. There was no blood. Her nightshirt was dry. She looked at her bedroom door. It was locked. She felt a massive wave of relief. It had been a false awakening, a dream within a dream. She got out of bed, feeling a bit shaky but immensely grateful. She went downstairs to the kitchen, determined to put the whole ordeal behind her. She walked to the marble island to start the coffee. She stopped. The 3 jagged lines were there. They were carved deep into the marble. Maya backed away, her hands shaking. She looked at her phone. The screen was normal, but when she checked her call logs, there was a call to 911 at 2:22 that lasted 0 seconds. She ran to the front door, wanting to get out of the house. As she reached for the deadbolt, she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. She stopped. She slowly pulled the collar of her nightshirt down, exposing her right shoulder. There, etched into her skin in dark, bruised lines, was the word, "Found." The nightmare hadn't ended when she woke up. The nightmare had simply waited for her to be fully conscious so she could experience the terror of knowing it was real. Maya Vance moved out of that house that same day. She never went back, not even for her furniture. She tells people she moved because of the commute, but the truth is, she is terrified of falling asleep in any room with a marble counter, because she knows that somewhere that man is still carving, and he knows exactly where she is. And that, my friends, is why this story of a dream that crossed the border into reality is truly strange, dark, and mysterious. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, stay safe out there. This story is about the chilling, relentless sensation that you are being watched not by a single stalker, but by a phenomenon. Our main character started to notice a face, the same face appearing in every photograph, every crowd, every fleeting glimpse of human life. This wasn't just coincidence. It was a terrifying, systematic intrusion that made him question if his entire world was a carefully crafted stage set just for him. This is the story of he kept seeing the same woman in every crowd. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. Now, let's travel to Chicago, Illinois. The year is 2014. we meet a man named David Chen. David was 32 years old, working as a data analyst. He was organized, logical, and deeply skeptical of anything that couldn't be quantified or proven with a spreadsheet. The incident that started everything was small, insignificant, and completely ignorable. David was scrolling through his phone, looking at photos from a major city marathon he had attended the previous Sunday. He wasn't running, he was just a spectator. He stopped on a wide-angle shot he had taken of the starting line, trying to capture the energy of the crowd. He zoomed in, just enjoying the chaos, when his eye caught a single face in the dense pack of runners, maybe a third of the way back from the front. It was a woman. She had distinct features: long, straight black hair, a narrow face, and a pair of large, square, red-framed glasses. It was a memorable face. David paused because the woman was wearing a highly distinctive bright yellow running shirt with a peculiar hand-drawn black symbol on the front, a jagged circle with a single line through it. David remembered seeing that symbol. He saved the photo and went on with his day. 2 days later, David was walking through the crowded downtown train station on his way to work. He was listening to music, lost in thought. As he passed a newsstand, he glanced at a large, brightly colored advertisement for a local theater production. It featured a dozen actors posing together, and there she was. Tucked into the background, fourth from the left, wearing a period costume but otherwise unmistakable. The woman with the long black hair and the distinct, narrow face. She wasn't wearing the red glasses, but the face was identical. David stopped. He stared at the poster for maybe 15 seconds. Then he shook his head. It's Chicago, he thought. There are millions of people here. It's an actor. Maybe she just looks similar to the runner. He took a quick, discreet photo of the poster and walked on. Over the next few weeks, the sightings escalated from coincidence to impossible. David started seeing her in places she couldn't possibly be. He was watching an old documentary on television about the 1950s Korean War, and in a fleeting crowd shot of American soldiers loading onto a troop ship, there she was, the narrow face, the black hair dressed in a Red Cross nurse's uniform. He saw her face or a face identical to hers in a photograph in a college history textbook, identified as a suffragette from the 1890s. He found her in the background of a tourism brochure for a beach in Thailand. The woman was physically identical in every sighting, though her clothing and context changed wildly across time and geography. David wasn't seeing a look-alike. He was seeing the exact same woman consistently. He decided to document everything. Being a data analyst, he created a massive file he titled The Constant. He collected every image, noting the date, location, and context. He even found her in 3 different stock photos used by the company he worked for. He showed his findings to his friend, Michael. Michael, seeing the dozens of photos, laughed. "Dude, this is awesome," Michael said. "It's called pareidolia. Your brain has fixed on a particular facial template, and now you're seeing that template everywhere. It's just confirmation bias, mixed with an average-looking face." To prove his point, Michael printed out 5 random stock photos of crowds, instructing David to find the woman in them. David searched carefully and found nothing. "See," Michael said, "your brain just sometimes gets a little obsessive." David felt relieved. He knew Michael was right. It was a statistical anomaly created by his own mind. He decided to stop looking. He felt fine for maybe 2 weeks. He went back to his life, focusing on his work. Then came the elevator incident. David was alone, waiting for the elevator in his large, modern office building. The walls of the elevator banks were covered in shiny, polished stainless steel. He pressed the button and stood, staring blankly at his own distorted reflection in the steel panel while he waited for the chime. The elevator arrived. The doors slid open. David took a step forward to enter the car, when he happened to glance at his reflection in the steel one last time. And this time, the reflection was not his. Standing in the steel panel, right behind him, was the woman. The long black hair, the narrow face, the large red-framed glasses. She was standing exactly where he knew the empty hallway to be. And the reflection of her face was completely devoid of expression, blank, cold, and utterly terrifying. David spun around, heart hammering against his ribs. The hallway was empty. He was completely alone. He looked back at the stainless steel. His own normal reflection was staring back at him. This was no longer pareidolia. This was a physical intrusion into his reality. The mirror-like surface had momentarily shown him the truth. The woman was always consistently behind him, just out of sight. David quit his job the next day. He liquidated his assets, sold his condo, and moved to a remote, tiny cabin in rural Montana, an area with a population of maybe 200 people. He cut off almost all contact with the outside world. He felt safe for a few months. He was completely isolated. He never went into town, ordering his supplies online to be dropped off at the end of his long dirt road. No crowds, no photos, no stainless steel. Then, one snowy afternoon, he decided to clean out the cabin's old basement, which hadn't been touched in decades. It was musty, filled with old mining equipment and boxes of junk. He moved an ancient, crumbling pile of newspapers. The top newspaper was from the year 1982, the local Montana paper, and the headline was about a major town council meeting. David used the paper to wipe the dust off his hands before tossing it. But just before he threw the paper into the trash barrel, he caught a glimpse of the photo accompanying the article, a wide-angle shot of the town hall, full of citizens attending the meeting. David dropped the paper. His heart seized up. Tucked away in the far corner of the photo, standing calmly by the exit door, was the woman. The black hair, the narrow face. But this time, she wasn't wearing an outfit from a different time or place. She was wearing a thick black down jacket, the exact same heavy coat that David himself had been wearing since he moved to the cabin. David stared at the photo, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't a historical anomaly. This was now. The woman wasn't just appearing in random crowds, she was appearing in the crowds David currently frequented, or in the places he currently inhabited across time. He looked around the empty, cold basement. If she was in the 1982 photo wearing his jacket, then she was a constant observer, tracking him through time and space, mocking him by wearing his own clothes. He knew she wasn't an ordinary human being. She was a fixture of his reality. An observer who had always been there, always waiting, always watching. And she was getting closer. He abandoned the cabin immediately, driving away without packing anything. He is currently living nomadically, never staying in one place for more than a few days, and critically, he avoids all forms of media, all photographs, all reflective surfaces, and above all, crowds. Because David knows, with absolute certainty, that the moment he relaxes, the moment he looks into a crowded scene or a mirror, she will be there. And the last thing he will ever see is her cold, blank, narrow face, wearing his clothes, waiting for him to finally catch up to the reality she is creating. And that, my friends, is why some people say that there are things in this world that are not alive or dead, but simply present, following you through time. It is a story that is truly strange, dark, and mysterious. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, to stay safe out there. This story is about a phenomenon that defies the laws of probability and enters the realm of the truly impossible. It involves a woman who decided to take a solo trip across the United States to find herself, only to discover that someone, or something, had already found her. Imagine traveling thousands of miles, changing your plans at the last minute, and staying in places you never intended to visit, only to see the exact same face waiting for you at every single stop. This is not a story about a stalker in the traditional sense. It is a story about a glitch in reality that became a personalized nightmare. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It is always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. This is the story of the same stranger who appeared in every city I visited. Our main character is 28-year-old Sarah Jenkins. In the summer of 2022, Sarah was at a crossroads in her life. She had just finished a high-stress corporate job in Seattle and decided she needed a total reset. She bought a reliable used SUV, packed her life into a few suitcases, and planned a 3-month solo road trip across America with no fixed itinerary. Sarah was an experienced traveler, smart, and very careful about her security. Her journey began in June of 2022. Her first major stop was Portland, Oregon. She spent 3 days there, visiting coffee shops and hiking nearby trails. On her final afternoon, she was sitting in a crowded park called Washington Park, enjoying the rose gardens. She was sitting on a bench, reading a book, when she noticed a man sitting on another bench about 50 feet away. He was unremarkable, maybe in his late 50s, wearing a faded gray baseball cap and a plain navy blue windbreaker. What struck her was that he was staring directly at her, not looking away when she made eye contact. He didn't have a book, a phone, or a dog. He was just sitting perfectly still. She felt a small chill, but dismissed it as just another eccentric city local and headed back to her hotel. 2 days later, Sarah was in Boise, Idaho, over 400 miles away. She had decided to stop there on a whim because she saw a sign for a local street festival while driving. While walking through a crowded outdoor market, she stopped to look at some handmade jewelry. As she turned to leave, she saw him, the same man. The gray cap, the navy windbreaker. He was standing by a fountain, watching her. There was no way he could have followed her car for 400 miles without her noticing, especially since she had changed her route twice to look at scenery. Her heart began to race. She tried to tell herself it was just a coincidence, a common look for men of that age, but the way he looked through her was different. Sarah decided to push her luck and drove 10 hours straight to Salt Lake City, Utah. She arrived late at night, exhausted and paranoid. She checked into a small boutique hotel she found on an app just minutes before arriving. She didn't even use her real name for the booking, using a nickname instead. The next morning, she went to a quiet breakfast diner 3 blocks from her hotel, hidden in a side street. As she sat down with her coffee, she looked toward the window. The man was standing on the sidewalk, looking through the glass directly at her booth. He was not moving, just standing there with a blank expression. Sarah dropped her spoon, her hands shaking uncontrollably. This was impossible. She had not posted her location on social media. She had not told anyone where she was going. She left her food untouched, ran back to her car, and drove away. Terrified, Sarah skipped all her planned sightseeing and got back on the interstate. She drove east, pushing toward Denver, Colorado. To test her theory, she took a series of back roads, doubling back on her tracks twice and stopping at a random, dusty gas station in the middle of a desolate stretch of Wyoming. She stayed in her car, locking the doors and watching her mirrors for hours. No one followed her. The road was empty. She felt a wave of relief, thinking she had finally lost him. She reached Denver late that night and decided to stay with an old college friend named Chloe to feel safe. That evening, Sarah and Chloe went to a rooftop bar in downtown Denver. It was crowded, loud, and filled with the smell of expensive cocktails. Sarah was finally starting to relax, laughing for the first time in days as Chloe told her stories about work. She felt the safety of the crowd. She glanced toward the elevator bank at the far end of the roof. The doors opened, and the man in the gray cap stepped out. He did not go to the bar. He did not look for a seat. He walked to the edge of the glass railing, turned his back to the city lights, and stared across the crowded deck until his eyes locked onto Sarah's. He raised one finger and pointed directly at her, his face devoid of any emotion. Sarah screamed, clutching Chloe's arm so hard she left bruises. Chloe looked in the direction of the elevator, but the man was gone. He had vanished into the crowd in a matter of seconds. Sarah told Chloe everything. They called the police, but there was nothing they could do. No crime had been committed, and Sarah had no photos of the man. The police told her to get some rest and stay in well-lit areas. The next morning, Sarah decided the trip was over. She was going to drive straight to her parents' house in a tiny town in Kansas, a place the man could not possibly know about. She drove for 8 hours, her eyes glued to the rearview mirror. She saw nothing but open highway and the shimmering heat of the road. She arrived at her parents' quiet suburban home at 10 o'clock at night. Her father, a retired police officer named Jim, met her at the door. She broke down in tears, explaining the stranger who was haunting her journey. Jim took it seriously. He locked every door, checked the perimeter with a high-powered flashlight, and sat in the living room with his service weapon nearby. Sarah finally felt she could sleep in her childhood bedroom, a place that felt truly disconnected from the outside world. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Sarah woke up to a sound. It was a soft, rhythmic thud against her window. Her room was on the second floor. She froze, her breath hitching in her throat. She slowly crept toward the window and pulled back the heavy curtain just an inch. The man was standing in the backyard, perfectly illuminated by the motion sensor floodlight Jim had installed. He was looking up at her window. He was no longer wearing the windbreaker. He was wearing the exact same outfit Sarah had been wearing the day she left Seattle 3 weeks ago, a bright yellow rain jacket and black leggings. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small printed photograph. He held it up against the light so Sarah could see it clearly. The photograph was of Sarah, taken from inside her SUV through the windshield while she was driving on the interstate between Idaho and Utah. In the photo, Sarah looked terrified, looking into her rearview mirror. But the most disturbing part was the reflection in the mirror in the photograph. It showed the man sitting in her back seat, inches away from her head while she was driving 70 miles per hour. He had been in the car with her. Sarah backed away from the window, screaming for her father. Jim ran into the room and then out into the backyard with his weapon drawn. But the yard was empty. There were no footprints in the soft garden soil under the window. There was no sign of anyone. The floodlight was still on, but the man had vanished. The next day, Jim took the car to a professional mechanic who specialized in security. They stripped the interior, checking under the seats, behind the door panels, and inside the trunk, looking for trackers or hidden cameras. They found nothing. But when they pulled the cabin air filter out from behind the glove box, they found something tucked inside. It was a small, handwritten note on a piece of faded yellow paper. It said, "You have a beautiful soul. I think I will keep it in every city we visit." Sarah realized then that the man was not following her car. He was not a person in the traditional sense. He was a manifestation of a glitch, a persistent anomaly that had attached itself to her existence. He didn't need a map or a tracker because he was part of the reality she was moving through. She was the anchor, and he was the shadow. Sarah eventually sold her car and moved to a high-rise apartment in Chicago with 24-hour security and no windows that could be reached from the ground. She rarely travels now, and she never goes anywhere alone. She still sees him sometimes, usually in the reflection of a store window as she walks by, or standing at the very back of a crowded subway car. He never approaches her anymore. He just stands there, wearing the gray cap, waiting for the next city, the next stop, the next piece of her life he can claim. And that, my friends, is why this story of the stranger who exists everywhere at once is truly strange, dark, and mysterious. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, stay safe out there.